Tonight, inflation across the board. The president's plan to combat skyrocketing prices hitting virtually every sector of the economy. Plus, supreme protest.
Keep abortion safe and legal.
Demonstrators on both sides of the abortion debate descend on the private homes of the high court justices. And COVID tracking canines.
If it has an odor, we can train the dog to find it.
And as the war in Ukraine drags on, the race to prevent global famine. All this and more up next on Faith Nation.
The work to combat record high inflation. Welcome to Faith Nation. I'm Jenna Browder.
I'm John Jessup. Even as prices keep rising, Washington mainly is still talking about how to address America's growing inflation crisis. Today, though, President Biden updated his plan to curb climbing costs while criticizing the GOP's competing efforts.
As the White House tiptoes around the word recession, states are moving to help struggling families. CBN's Brody Carter joins us with the latest. Brody?
John, Jenna, billed as the Biden-Harris inflation plan to lower costs and the deficit, the president seemed to spend a lot of time on who's to blame, pointing the finger at Vladimir Putin, the pandemic, and Republicans.
I think gas prices are out of control.
Americans are fighting the highest inflation rate since 1982. The average cost of a gallon of gas just hit an all-time high at $4.37. That's up 23 cents from last month, according to AAA.
I know you got to be frustrated. I know. I can taste it.
The president emphasizing his top economic priority, tackling inflation.
And to reduce our dependence on foreign oil and reckless autocrats like Putin, I'm working with Congress to pass landmark investments to help build a clean energy future as well.
It's not just gas prices on the rise, as the cost of food at the grocery store is up 10% in just the last year, with prices expected to jump another 5 to 6% this year. Rising daycare costs takes a greater slice of a parent's salary now, averaging $13,000 a year.
And once again, the president did not even acknowledge the housing crisis. The cost for a mortgage on a typical median price home, that has gone up 50%.
Joel Griffith of the Heritage Foundation says the president still isn't offering any real solutions.
Green energy? Really?
Meanwhile, individual states are taking action. Kansas is pushing to cut grocery sales tax on groceries. New Mexico is considering tax rebates up to $1,000 due to high gas prices. Iowa, Indiana, and Idaho have all cut state income taxes this year. Despite an economy that created 428,000 jobs last month and showed growth in 2021, the current 8.5% inflation rate is quickly eroding any gains recovered from the pandemic. And while Americans pay the price, leaders on Capitol Hill continue to play partisan politics.
The other path is the ultra MAGA plan put forward by congressional Republicans to raise taxes on working families, lower the income of American workers, threaten sacred programs Americans count on like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and give break after break to big corporations and billionaires.
Other moves described as possible big solutions to slow inflation include dropping former President Trump's tariffs against China and allowing a federal gas tax holiday. However, President Biden says no decision has been made on either one. Tomorrow, economists will be waiting on April's consumer price index, as it will be the next signal as to the direction of the economy. John, Jenna, back to you.
All right, Brody Carter, thank you very much. Well, protesters are falling under new scrutiny after demonstrations over abortion outside the homes of Supreme Court justices. Last night, abortion rights advocates descending on the home of Justice Samuel Alito, who wrote the leaked draft opinion overturning Roe v. Wade. Justice Alito and his family had to move to an undisclosed location for their safety. Protesters have also gathered outside the homes of Justice Brett Kavanaugh and Chief Justice John Roberts.
And here with us now is Carrie Severino, president of Judicial Crisis Network. Carrie, thank you for joining us tonight. Last weekend, a firebomb targeted a pro-life group in Wisconsin, obviously illegal and something the White House did condemn. Kerry, there are also laws about the legality of picketing judges, juries, or court officers to influence court cases. Today, though, Press Secretary Jen Psaki said the White House encourages people to protest outside of homes peacefully. Kerry, can you parse this for us? Are these protests at the justice's home illegal, or are they protected under free speech?
Yeah, it's funny. The same president whose administration was treating parents at school board meetings like domestic terrorists, and which created its Disinformation and Governance Board, is suddenly now First Amendment absolutists. It's very strange. You know, there is a federal law that prohibits trying to influence court officials and judges by picketing at their private residences. I don't know if the White House wants to challenge that on First Amendment grounds, but I think there's very common sense reasons, and there are First Amendment principles that say we can't have things that would be potentially promoting violence. And unfortunately, we know all too well the potential risks that there are for Supreme Court justices, especially with this decision not really out there. Everyone knows what the draft said right now, but if something were to happen to one of the justices before the decision were released, obviously all bets are off what would actually go on at the court. So I think it's absolutely correct to be enforcing these laws to their full extent. And unfortunately, the White House seems to be more encouraging the protests rather than discouraging them at their private homes. But the Supreme Court is one thing. Absolutely, go there and state your opinions on either side of the issue. But people's homes adds a level of implicit threat that I think is inappropriate.
Critics lashed out at Governor Glenn Youngkin for not protecting Justice Samuel Alito's home in Virginia. Is that appropriately placed blame, or does state law or local law enforcement ultimately bear that responsibility, Kerry?
I think there is a role for both for the marshals. There's a role for the federal government enforcing those federal laws, and there's a role for the state police doing so as well. It's a difficult situation, and unfortunately, again, it's one that the White House just keeps on pouring fuel on this fire. It would go a long way if we had Democrat politicians from the White House on down who were discouraging this rather than giving their seal of approval to this type of activity. Even if the protests so far have thankfully not led to violence, we all know that there are people that are crazy people out there, that having those addresses now doxxed puts our justices and their families at risk. This is why the Senate is just passed through a bill that's going to add the ability to have marshals protecting the immediate family members of justices as well as the justices themselves. I'm glad to see that, but that's not enough as long as we don't have our police authorities also stepping in and people using their bullhorn that they have to try to tamp down this. We're seeing protests at churches as well, also illegal. This needs to be immediately and clearly stated from people on both sides of the aisle. This is not appropriate.
All right, Kerry Severino, president of the Judicial Crisis Network. Thank you, Kerry. Good to see you.
Thanks, Kerry.
Thanks.
Well, to tech news, if the sale of Twitter goes through, Elon Musk says the platform's most prominent banned user, Donald Trump, will have his account restored. The Tesla CEO and world's richest man made the announcement today at an auto conference, saying it was a, quote, mistake to ban Mr. Trump in the wake of the January 6th Capitol attack. For his part, the former president has said he will not return to Twitter. Instead, he'll stay on his own Truth Social platform.
Turning overseas to Ukraine, and new red flags from top U.S. officials. One general warning that Russia could resort to nuclear weapons if the country faces an existential threat. A top U.S. spy adding in a Senate hearing that the conflict in the next few months could become increasingly unpredictable and potentially escalatory.
Putin most likely also judges that Russia has a greater ability and willingness to endure challenges than his adversaries, and he is probably counting on U.S. and EU resolve to weaken as food shortages, inflation, energy prices get worse.
Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines cautioning President Vladimir Putin is preparing Russia for prolonged conflict with ambitions beyond the Donbass. Haines describing Putin's focus on eastern Ukraine as a temporary shift. And with that, let's bring in John Hardy, a senior Russia analyst with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. John, welcome. So in today's hearing on the Hill, the director of national intelligence there said that Putin has not changed his aims in Ukraine. Is this focus on the East a temporary shift to regain momentum after failing to capture Kyiv?
Well, thanks for having me. You know, I was really struck by that testimony because it would suggest that, you know, if Russia does succeed in taking the rest of the Donbass, that it will, you know, Putin will think about broader aims. And to me, that's really interesting because at this point, it seems that Russia lacks the capacity to pursue really broader aims. To me, it's unclear whether Russia will succeed in taking the rest of Donbass in the first place. So to be thinking beyond that, I think, is really ambitious on the part of Putin. And it could point to the fact that he may not have a realistic understanding of the situation on the ground, and certainly one that might not necessarily correspond to our understanding.
In that same hearing, John, the director of the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, warned senators that Russia likely will wield nuclear threats. John, do you agree that this is potentially where Putin may be headed?
Well, you know, we've seen Putin engage in sort of what you could call nuclear saber rattling. I think, you know, based on Russian military doctrine, it would have to be, I think, what Putin would see as an existential threat to Russia for Russia to actually use nuclear weapons. You know, I have no doubt that Putin may resort to additional nuclear saber rattling, but the actual use of a nuclear weapon would really be something just very extraordinary, you know, to state the obvious. So I guess the question is what Putin will define as an existential threat. You know, he's framed the war in Ukraine in existential terms, but, you know, I'm not sure that rhetoric would quite rise to the level of meriting those weapons, at least in his mind.
Yeah. Senators Graham and Blumenthal introduced joint legislation today designating Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism. What kind of pressure, John, would that put on Russia?
Well, it would really up the economic pressure. And, you know, so under that law, you can do a number of different things. One of them is target countries that continue to trade with Russia. So, you know, just depending on how the executive branch, you know, used its authorities, the economic impact on Russia could be quite significant. And we know, of course, the Ukrainians have actually asked Biden directly to levy that penalty on Russia.
John, real quickly, in about the 30 or so seconds we have left, we know that the president is thinking about breaking up the funding with COVID and for the defending Ukraine. That's about $13.6 billion in emergency funding. What kind of impact will that have in the conflict?
Well, that funding will be vital. And, you know, Biden is almost out of his drawdown funding. So he really needs more quickly so that we can continue supporting Ukraine with weapons and other things without any, you know, break in that process.
Okay, John Hardy with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Great to get your insights. Thank you, John.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Russia's bloody war in Ukraine causing ripple effects on dinner tables across the globe. Coming up, the fight to stave off the looming food crisis. Welcome back. A developing food crisis is spiraling into catastrophe.
The war in Ukraine has global leaders racing to prevent a famine from spreading to countries around the world. CBN Capitol Hill correspondent Matt Galka reports.
Ukraine is known as the world's breadbasket because it supplies so much grain to multiple countries. But those wheat fields feeding millions of people have since been cut off from global regular supply, leaving a potential food crisis for millions looming.
I wish we were meeting under different circumstances, but the reality is that we're facing rising global food insecurity.
Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen kicked off these high-level meetings by focusing on the dangerous ripple effect of the Russian war on Ukraine. Yellen told her global economic counterparts that Russia is to blame for exacerbating a widespread food crisis.
This threat touches the most vulnerable people the hardest, families that are already spending disproportionate amounts of their income on food. Moreover, the interconnectedness of the global food system means that people on every continent are impacted.
Yellen pointed out that before the war began, some 800 million people lived in areas suffering from a shortage of food. Ukraine and Russia produce almost 15% of the world's wheat supply. Impoverished countries throughout the Middle East and Africa rely on wheat fields now cut off from the global supply chain, either by fighting or by blistering sanctions. The U.S. and its allies are working to prevent potentially millions of people from starving due to rising costs worldwide.
In the developing world, a typical family of a poor family spends as much as 2/3 of their income on food. And our estimates show that for each 1% increase in the food prices, 10 million people may be thrown into extreme poverty.
The war is hitting Lebanon hard, where Christian aid groups like Heart for Lebanon are trying to keep up with demand. About half of all Lebanese children are in need of assistance.
Lebanon counts on 87% of its grain and wheat from Ukraine. After the Port of Beirut explosion on August 4th, 2020, which totally destroyed the grain silos in Lebanon, we've been living off on a 1-month supply. And now when you have a war like you do in Ukraine, it's becoming very, very hard to get.
Treasury Secretary Yellen will be having a closed-door meeting with Ukraine's prime minister as she goes through a flurry of meetings with global economic leaders to try and come up with a solution to this global food crisis. Matt Gelka, CBN News.
All right, thank you, Matt. Well, how do you sniff out COVID infections in a crowd? When we come back, man's best friend joins the fight against COVID-19. The Centers for Disease Control is warning of another 100 million COVID infections this fall and winter. So accurate testing is extremely important. And now man's best friend is helping out.
A Virginia company is training dogs to detect the virus, testing large numbers of people in a short amount of time. Mark Martin brings us more on the continuing fight against COVID.
Oh, you want to play. Oh, you want to play.
Instructor James Overton plays with Blade, a German Shepherd Belgian Malinois mix. The 3-year-old is one of dozens at American Canine Interdiction, a Virginia company that says it has real-world canine solutions. Paul Ruscia has led efforts here for 18 years.
Primarily what we do, we take dogs and we condition them to find explosives, narcotics, bed bugs, and COVID. If it has an odor, we can train the dog to find it.
These dogs, they never cease to amaze us. I don't think we deserve these dogs. I think their capabilities, I think we're just starting to scratch the surface of the things that these dogs are able to do for us.
Ruscia says the idea to train dogs to detect COVID came after hearing a competitor discuss the concept.
So I mulled it over and prayed over it and led by the Spirit. And the team that you're going to meet here in a little while, we got our heads together and said, here's the methodology we could probably use. So we went with a cheek swab. We didn't use urine, we didn't use sweat, we didn't use the protein molecules. We went with an actual sample from the mouth, pretty much like the SNAP test, if you will.
So we partnered with the hospitals, and they were able to get us samples from people that were currently being treated for COVID-19. We got the cheek swabs from them, and then what we ended up doing is training the dogs to recognize the smell of the cheek swab first.
After that, Overton says they introduced the dogs to the smell of a person's saliva without COVID.
We got the dogs to discriminate between the smell of somebody infected versus not infected with an astonishing accuracy rate.
It's just remarkable how sensitive their olfactory capabilities are and their ability to find this stuff. It's north of 95% accurate.
Andrew Casekamp is in charge of training and education.
I was actually one of the skeptics. I said, there's no way. There's no way. I've done this a long time. I do not believe that it's possible, and I'm kind of glad that they proved me wrong. You know, watching them actually go out and have the accuracy that they have is astounding.
One of the primary benefits for using dogs to detect COVID is speed. Staff here say a dog can screen 30 to 40 people in less than a minute, compared to it takes around 15 minutes to get the results back on just one rapid antigen test. Casekamp and his 3-year-old Dutch Shepherd Pashka demonstrate how it works, while Overton breaks it down for us.
So what this system does is does a couple things. One, it prevents the dog from actually being able to get the sample. So you'll see this little filter inside of here that actually prevents the dog from being able to stick his nose all the way in and grab the sample out. But what it also does is it also focuses that odor right here into the edge of the funnel. So when you see it later, when the dogs come in, the dog will come in here and stick his nose inside the funnel, able to get that concentrated area of odor right here. And then, you know, if it's a positive sample, then the dog would alert. Otherwise, he'll keep on going.
For our test, Overton uses a neutral odor that was used to train the dogs in the initial training, not an actual virus. As you can see, Pashka alerts by sitting down in front of the target tube.
So if this were a real-world situation, the dogs would come in here. Each tube system would be labeled so that we know whose sample is which one. With our barcode system that we have in our app, they would come in here. If the dog indicates on this one, then this tube gets flagged as this was one of the hot tubes.
Overton believes the dogs are a match for searching large groups of people.
Anywhere where there's large crowds of people in close proximity to each other. So cruise ships, stadiums, concert venues, schools, hospitals, anywhere, even the airlines, any of those applications would be perfect for something like this.
Rusha says he prays over the dogs constantly and relies on divine intervention.
I ask for that knowledge, wisdom, and discernment on a daily basis. And then just trust the prompting of the Holy Spirit. You know, go find that quiet space. The world's loud, and God likes to whisper. So I like to just go find that quiet little space and wait for his prompting. And if he tells me go forward with it, I do. And if he speaks to my heart and says don't do that, then I don't.
And adds, at the end of the day, his work is all for God's glory. Mark Martin, CBN News, Carsville, Virginia.
God's creation for God's glory. Thanks, Mark. Coming up, Ukraine's president, praised for his bravery, awards a Medal of Honor to another fearless furry fighter. We'll show you next.
Finally tonight, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky routinely ends his nightly wartime addresses by announcing awards for Ukraine's soldiers.
Among the latest honorees, perhaps Ukraine's smallest fighter, a Jack Russell Terrier named Patron. Patron, whose name means ammo in Ukrainian, sniffs out Russian mines. So far, he's found more than 200 explosive devices. Look at that cute guy. The bomb-hunting hound also shows children how to safely avoid mine threats while serving as a mascot for the country's state emergency service. Well, congratulations to little Patron.
He's cute. You know, all hands, all paws on deck.
I like it, Jenna.
Yeah.
Quite clever.
All right. That's going to do it for Faith Nation tonight.
Thanks for watching. We'll see you again right here tomorrow.